Welcome to the debate. Today, we're looking into a really sensitive, but I think crucial area of human connection, the dating landscape for trans women. We're essentially analyzing how these external forces can shape attraction, interaction, and while often fundamentally alter the dynamics of romance.
Yeah, and the challenge here, I think, is really understanding this enormous gap between, rising visibility on one hand and genuine societal acceptance on the other. Trans women are out there seeking meaningful, authentic relationships, but they constantly have to navigate this minefield of stigma and misunderstanding.
Absolutely. So the central question we're grappling with today is this. How much does the attraction of cisgender men to trans women depend on these, let's say, restrictive sociocultural frameworks? Things like exoticized terminology, hyperfeminine aesthetics, or even fetishization, versus attraction being genuinely rooted in, individual open-mindedness and just acceptance of the woman's authentic self.
Okay, and I'll be arguing that authentic, long-lasting connections are built fundamentally on that individual acceptance, on the partner's capacity to see trans women simply as women, really regardless of all the societal noise and the structural barriers that seem designed to prevent that very recognition.
See, I disagree with that prioritization. I'm going to maintain that for, a critical mass of cisgender men, their initial attraction and often their sustained attraction is heavily shaped by these external cultural frameworks. And this often requires the woman to adhere to very specific, sometimes quite traditional roles and aesthetics that frankly reinforce existing expectations.
I understand the skepticism, I do, but let's maybe start by talking about the goal, right? The goal of these relationships. Now, I don't deny the structural barriers exist. The vilification, the fear of rejection, the intense self-hatred even, that societal pressure can cause, that's all real. But the quality of a successful relationship, I believe, comes down to the partner seeing the trans woman as a whole, authentic person.
But are those authentic connections really the statistical norm? Or are they perhaps remarkable exceptions that manage to thrive despite a hostile system?
I'd say they're the evidence that individual acceptance actually works. I mean, the source material we looked at is full of stories where success is achieved simply because someone finds a partner who is, quote, just a decent person, and who just saw trans women as women, end quote. These relationships succeed based on shared humanity, things like compatibility, emotional connection, bonding over mutual hobbies, whether it's sci-fi or tabletop gaming, it doesn't matter. That focus on a shared life and mutual respect, that's the true foundation for fulfillment.
But that perspective, I think, risks missing the critical mass. While those positive stories definitely exist and they're important, are they really representative, or are they outliers against this backdrop of systemic pressure that sort of defines the dating pool before genuine connection can even really begin? I argue that the attraction of cisgender men is, quite frequently, rooted in cultural contexts that actively define specific roles and visual aesthetics, and this leads almost directly to sexualization.
Okay, you point to cultural contexts. Where do you see this framing being most apparent?
Well, it becomes really stark when we look at specific global hubs. Places like, say, Bangkok or Manila. The local terms used there, ladyboy, kathoes, or transpinai, they're tied explicitly, often commercially, to nightlife, to entertainment, to transactional encounters. This framework doesn't really offer individuality. It creates an expectation of a specific, often hyperfeminine commodity. And furthermore, you see some cisgender men being drawn to a specific, perceived hyperfemininity, one they feel cisgender women are increasingly rejecting. They might see trans women as, and this is a quote, willfully filling a role that was designated for women by the patriarchy.
I find that framing deeply problematic. It suggests the male gaze prefers a kind of constructed compliance over genuine individuality.
It's more than just problematic. I think it's definitive of the attraction for many. And this gets reinforced when you look at discussions about physical attraction, particularly attraction to pre- or non-operative trans women. For some men, the focus is highly mechanical, almost. They describe viewing the genitalia, less as a penis, and, quote, more that it is very clearly communicating whether it's turned on. This preference is often rooted in a kind of sexual familiarity, seeing it as, quote, familiar plumbing. They understand better than female anatomy. Now, when attraction prioritizes that kind of mechanical familiarity and specific sexual dynamics, it really confirms the power of these predefined roles over individual personhood.
That definitely shifts the discussion from genuine attraction towards comfort and familiarity, which is, yeah, that's a distinction we need to hold on to. But before we maybe focus too much on those individual positive stories, we have to tackle the language barrier itself, don't we? Isn't terminology often the structural barrier to entry?
Precisely. I mean, the continued prevalence of these contested regional terms like ladyboy in travel and entertainment contexts. Think red light districts or the girls' bars in Manila. It highlights exactly how cultural framing immediately shifts the perception of trans women into an other, or maybe a specific commodity for tourists, rather than fully integrated women.
Right. I agree that institutional language and media portrayal are huge factors here. Huge. However, we also have to recognize agency in language, don't we? Some trans women actively choose to reclaim contested terms like tranny, reframing their own self-definition. So agency exists even when facing widespread stigma.
Well, I acknowledge that agency in reclamation, absolutely. But that doesn't just dissolve the wider systemic stigma, does it? I mean, when you consider some reports show acceptance rates as low as, 3% among straight men who would even consider dating a trans woman, we have to acknowledge how deeply entrenched these structural barriers outside of, highly niche or commercial environments. That tiny percentage suggests that the pervasive stigma, often fueled by these negative media portrayals where trans women are, quote, cast as villains in film and television, it severely restricts genuine acceptance.
Yeah, that 3% figure it's sobering. It really speaks volumes about the societal climate. But focusing exclusively on negative media framing, I think, risks overlooking the community's resilience. Maybe the antidote to harmful stereotyping is amplifying those individual stories of success, where acceptance does happen through shared humanity. It's about two people bonding over a mutual love of giant robot anime and tabletop RPGs, like in one account. That shared connection is how people can bypass the stigma sometimes.
But doesn't the very fact that bonding over giant robot anime is considered noteworthy just highlight the tremendous effort required simply to escape the default societal script of sexualization? Let's maybe dig a bit deeper into that concept you brought up earlier, hyperfemininity.
Yes, right. The idea that attraction is somehow dependent on this maximalist performance of gender.
I'd argue it absolutely is for a significant subset of men. The observation that trans women attract cis-het men because they, quote, take it to the max with hyperfemininity, even citing adherence to very traditional behaviors like spending time in an apron, cleaning and cooking, that suggests the attraction is fundamentally tied to adherence to traditional gender expectations. And crucially, expectations that many cis women are actively resisting. So if the attraction relies on performing a traditional role, one designated by patriarchy, then the preference seems clearly for a constructed aesthetic, not necessarily the woman's intrinsic self.
I'm sorry, but I don't really buy that essentialist interpretation. That argument seems to ignore the internal journey. Equating hyperfemininity with a desire to perform for men ignores that trans women, like all people, are, quote, multifaceted. The whole process of intense self-discovery and transition often involves embracing a self-defined femininity. A woman who has undergone, quote, such an intense self-discovery often prioritizes her own self-worth and self-love. Her aesthetic, even if it looks outwardly traditional or maximalist, might well be derived from her own self-actualization, not just external compliance.
But even if that's the woman's motivation, if a cis man exclusively seeks out this hyper-feminine aesthetic and explicitly states that it's fulfilling a traditional designated role for him, then the mechanism of attraction is still fundamentally linked to the role itself, isn't it? If the cis partner requires that performance to sustain the attraction, the relationship is still structured around an external requirement.
Perhaps initially, but I'd argue a relationship structured solely around performance like that cannot last. And that eventual failure, in a way, validates my initial point. The ultimate key to a lasting, meaningful connection is the man's willingness and ability to see past the aesthetic to the individual underneath.
That's a compelling argument for sure. But let's look at the spectrum of intent here, particularly when we consider the prevalence of transactional encounters. The reality in settings like, say, the girls' bars in Manila. It raises the question of whether attraction is truly romantic when it's conditioned by expenditure.
You're referring to those documented instances where a man might reflect that, quote, if I didn't sleep with her, it felt like it would have been kind of a waste after, spending money on drinks all evening.
Exactly. That kind of calculation, the expectation that expenditure should precede and precondition the sexual act, it really blurs the line between sex work and dating. This transactional framework, often compounded by economic necessity for the woman and sometimes managed environments, strongly reinforces the non-romantic, often purely fetishized nature of those interactions.
Okay, the context in Manila where a trans woman's economic necessity is clearly a factor. That's undeniable. But does the existence of these transactional situations completely negate the possibility of genuine feeling on the trans woman's side? Some reports indicate she might have slept with a foreigner not only for business, but because she, quote, wanted to or maybe saw a, quote, chance of landing a boyfriend. The human desire for connection, it's still present even under duress.
That longing for connection is poignant, yes, but even the aspiration for genuine romance in that specific environment is still filtered through and framed by the economic transaction. The system itself tends to define the interaction.
And that may often be true for those commercial environments, but the counterpoint exists too. True open-mindedness, demonstrated by partners who are described as totally down with the cause, allows for love stories that thrive entirely outside of those stigmatized settings. They prioritize emotional support, shared goals, the simple reality of building a life together, proving that individual respect can overcome those structural pressures.
And I suppose that individual effort to create self-care and community, whether it's through hobbies or mutual aid, is essential for survival in what can be a hostile environment. Which is why we see these widespread fears about legal and social safety leading to increased community organizing and resilience.
Indeed. And the strength derived from that self-actualization, from that resilience, becomes the source of authentic connection when it finally occurs.
So this discussion has really highlighted, I think, the immense duality faced by trans women in dating. They have to constantly navigate these overwhelming cultural expectations and deeply ingrained societal stigma, while simultaneously seeking, the enduring human capacity for genuine and respectful relationships.
And I believe that while, yes, terminology, aesthetics, and restrictive cultural frameworks certainly precondition the superficial interactions for many cisgender men, the most successful relationships ultimately prove that profound connection is built on foundational principles: acceptance, mutual respect, and honoring a trans woman's journey towards self-actualization, seeing her as a whole person.
And I would maintain that the data, or at least the strong indications, showing attraction is often linked to specific roles, aesthetics, and frequently economic settings, proves that these structural pressures still heavily define the dating pool for many. The very fact that genuine connection often seems to require the cis male partner to be totally down with the cause, as you quoted, well, that just underscores how high the bar of true acceptance remains for the majority.
And that's precisely why we must recognize and frankly celebrate that individual resilience when it overcomes those barriers. Understanding this whole landscape requires acknowledging the powerful external constraints while simultaneously celebrating the authentic capacity for deep connection that's documented in the material. There is clearly much more to explore within this sphere of human interaction.